Just freshen up in here while we finish getting ready, Mother, my future daughter-in-law said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she guided me into the country club bathroom. What Vanessa couldn't have anticipated was that my decades as a retired locksmith would help me escape the bathroom she deliberately jammed shut, or that Officer Martinez, my weekly chess partner from the senior center, would believe me immediately when I called about the forged documents and stolen jewelry I'd discovered in her overnight bag, leading to her arrest in the middle of what should have been my son's wedding ceremony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and at 73 years old, I've learned that even the most carefully crafted deceptions can unravel with a single thread of truth. I spent 42 years as a locksmith in Maplewood, a charming suburb outside of Philadelphia, where my late husband Charles built a respected dental practice while we raised our only son, Michael. Our modest colonial home on Elm Street became the center of neighborhood gatherings, holiday celebrations, and countless family milestones. I can still picture Michael learning to ride his bicycle on our sloped driveway, Charles running alongside with one hand steadying the seat, until that magical moment when our boy found his balance and took off on his own. Those simple family moments were the foundation of what I believed was an unshakable bond between us. Charles and I had worked hard to build our lives together. We weren't wealthy by conventional standards, but prudent saving and Charles's attention to investments had created a comfortable financial cushion for our retirement. When Charles passed away 5 years ago after a brief but aggressive illness, I found myself alone for the first time in nearly 5 decades, with a paid-off home and sufficient savings to maintain my independence. My locksmith business had begun almost by accident. After completing secretarial school in my early 20s, I had taken a receptionist position at Maplewood Security and Locks, expecting it to be temporary until Charles finished dental school. But when the owner, Mr. Franklin, noticed my unusual interest in the mechanical aspects of the locks they serviced, he began teaching me the trade during lunch breaks and after hours. "You've got a natural gift for understanding mechanisms," he told me, after I had successfully disassembled and reassembled a complex safe lock on my first attempt. "Most people see a lock and think it's magic. You see the patterns and relationships between the components. What started as curiosity bloomed into genuine passion. By the time Charles had established his dental practice, I had earned my locksmith certification and become Mr. Franklin's most trusted employee. When he decided to retire 15 years later, Charles and I took a considerable risk by purchasing the business, renaming it Blackwood Security and Locks. "Are you sure about this?" Charles had asked as we signed the bank loan documents. "It's a lot of responsibility to take on." "I've never been more certain of anything," I had replied, the weight of the decision balanced by the confidence of doing something I truly loved and excelled at. The business flourished under my management, expanding from residential services to commercial security systems for local businesses and eventually securing contracts with several banks and government buildings in the area. Being a female locksmith in the 1970s and 80s presented numerous challenges: the skeptical looks from new clients, the dismissive attitudes from some male competitors, the occasional refusal to deal with the little lady, rather than a male, employee. But those obstacles only strengthened my resolve and honed my skills further. Michael grew up watching me overcome these prejudices, seeing firsthand how persistence and excellence could overcome social barriers. I had hoped these lessons would shape his character, teaching him to value substance over appearance and to recognize genuine capability regardless of packaging. For many years, I believed they had. As a child, Michael had shown remarkable curiosity about my work, sitting beside me for hours as I explained the inner workings of different lock mechanisms. By 12, he could pick simple locks himself, understanding the principles of tension and manipulation that most adults never grasp. His methodical mind and attention to detail served him well in school, particularly in mathematics and physics. "Has your mechanical intelligence Charles observed one evening after helping Michael with a particularly challenging geometry assignment, but applied to numbers and concepts instead of physical mechanisms. This aptitude eventually led Michael to pursue finance rather than following either of his parents' career paths. After graduating from Penn State with honors, he accepted a position with a Boston investment firm, marking the beginning of his gradual drift from our close-knit family environment into a world that valued different metrics of success. His visits home became less frequent as his career advanced. Phone calls grew shorter and more perfunctory. The detailed stories of his daily life that he had once shared freely became brief summaries focused primarily on professional achievements. Charles and I discussed this change between ourselves, but chose not to confront Michael directly, recognizing that establishing independence was both natural and necessary. He needs to find his own path, Charles had reasoned during one of our conversations about the growing distance. We raised him with solid values. They'll guide him even if we're not there reminding him of every principle. I had nodded in agreement, though something in my heart questioned whether the values of his new environment might eventually overwrite the foundations we had laid. The financial world Michael inhabited operated by different rules than our middle-class suburb, measuring worth in portfolio sizes and bonus structures rather than community connections and personal integrity. When Charles was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer in his late 60s, Michael returned home immediately, taking a 2-week leave from his firm to help during the initial shock and treatment planning. His presence during that difficult time reassured me that beneath the polished exterior of the successful financial analyst, our son still carried the compassion and family loyalty we had instilled throughout his childhood. But as Charles's condition stabilized into what would be a 15-month battle, Michael's visits became increasingly brief and scheduled around business trips to Philadelphia rather than specifically to see his father. He called regularly, always asking about treatment progress and offering to help with medical expenses, which our insurance and savings fortunately covered. But the emotional presence I had hoped for remained limited. He's doing his best in his own way, Charles defended him during a particularly difficult evening, when Michael had cut short a weekend visit for an emergency client meeting that could have been handled by colleagues. Not everyone processes grief the same way. Charles passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, with me holding his hand as he took his final breaths in our home hospice setup. Michael arrived 3 hours later, having taken the first available flight from Boston after my call. The genuine grief in his eyes when he saw his father's body reassured me that despite the physical and emotional distance he had maintained, the connection between them had remained meaningful. The funeral brought a surprise. Michael had arranged for several of Charles's former dental school classmates to attend, locating and contacting people his father hadn't seen in decades but had spoken of fondly throughout the years. This thoughtful gesture revealed the attentive, caring son I had raised, briefly emerging from behind the polished professional facade he had constructed. Following Charles's death, Michael stayed for a full week, helping me navigate the initial paperwork and logistics that follow a spouse's passing. We spent several evenings reviewing family photo albums and sharing memories, conversations that momentarily bridged the gap that had grown between us. During those nights, I caught glimpses of the thoughtful, sensitive child who had once sat beside me at my workbench, absorbing both technical skills and life lessons. Before returning to Boston, Michael set up automatic bill payments for my utilities and subscribed me to a grocery delivery service, practical solutions that reflected both genuine concern and his tendency to address emotional needs with logistical fixes. "Call me anytime, Mom," he said at the airport, embracing me tightly. "I can be on a plane within hours if you need anything." I nodded, appreciating the sincerity in his offer, while recognizing that we defined need quite differently. His focus remained on practical emergencies, health crises, home repairs, financial concerns, while my deeper desire for regular connection and emotional presence went largely unaddressed. In the years following Charles's death, I worked to build a fulfilling life as a widow I had sold the locksmith business 2 years before Charles's diagnosis, though I maintained a small workshop in the garage where I occasionally repaired antique locks for select clients and friends who appreciated the craftsmanship of vintage mechanisms. These projects kept my hands and mind active while providing links to the professional identity that had defined much of my adult life. I joined a weekly chess club at the local senior center, finding unexpected joy in the strategic thinking and social connection it provided. Officer Martinez, a recently retired police detective who had been one of my business contacts, during his active service became my regular chess partner and eventually a close friend. His sharp mind and stories from his law enforcement career reminded me of the satisfaction I had found in my own work, where solving mechanical puzzles often felt like detective work of a different kind. "You would have made a good investigator, Eleanor," Ramon told me one afternoon after I had spotted a subtle pattern in his play that allowed me to counter his strategy 3 moves later. "You see connections others miss, and you're patient enough to wait for confirmation before acting." His observation made me smile, recognizing the same qualities that had made me successful as a locksmith. The ability to observe patterns, understand motivations, and recognize when something was out of place had served me well professionally and personally throughout my life. Michael maintained regular monthly calls during this period, usually on Sunday evenings, conversations that followed a predictable pattern, brief inquiries about my health and activities, updates on his career advancement, and reminders of his availability should any emergency arise. He visited Philadelphia twice yearly, once during the winter holidays and again around my birthday in May, short trips carefully scheduled around business obligations and vacation plans. During one such birthday visit 3 years after Charles's death, Michael seemed unusually distracted, checking his phone frequently and stepping away for calls multiple times during our dinner at my favorite local restaurant. When I gently inquired if everything was all right, he hesitated before responding. "Actually, Mom, I've been seeing someone," he admitted, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "It's fairly new, but significant." This revelation surprised me not, because Michael dated, he had mentioned various women casually over the years, but because he had never before described any relationship as significant. At 40, he had established patterns that suggested career would always take precedence over personal connections, making this development noteworthy. "Tell me about her," I encouraged, genuinely curious about who had managed to capture my son's closely guarded attention. "Her name is Vanessa Reynolds," he replied, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen since his college years. "She works in client relations at Hampton Financial. We met at an industry conference last year but only started dating recently. She's brilliant, driven, understands my work in a way no one else ever has." The emphasis on professional compatibility raised subtle concerns, but I pushed them aside, focusing instead on my son's evident happiness. "She sounds wonderful. I'd love to meet her sometime." "Definitely," Michael promised, though he quickly steered the conversation back to safer territory. My garden renovations and his recent promotion to senior portfolio manager. 9 months passed before Vanessa's name resurfaced in our conversations, despite my occasional gentle inquiries. Then, in February, came the unexpected phone call that would ultimately lead to the bathroom at Westbrook Country Club, and the most shocking day of my life since Charles's diagnosis. "Mom, I have amazing news." Michael's voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Vanessa and I are engaged." The announcement caught me completely off guard. In our monthly calls, he had mentioned Vanessa only sporadically, giving no indication that their relationship had progressed to such a significant level. Still, I responded with genuine happiness for my son, who had spent so many years prioritizing career over personal fulfillment. "That's wonderful, Michael. I'm so happy for you both. When do I get to meet my future daughter-in-law?" "Soon," he promised. "We're planning a June wedding, just a small ceremony at Vanessa's family's country club. Nothing elaborate." The timeline startled me even more than the engagement itself. June? This June? That's only 4 months away. We don't see any reason to wait, Michael explained, a defensive note entering his voice. At our age, long engagements seem unnecessary. Vanessa is incredibly efficient. She's already securing vendors and handling most of the arrangements. I murmured appropriate congratulations while processing this information. Michael had always been methodical and deliberate in major decisions, often researching even minor purchases for weeks before committing. This sudden engagement and rushed wedding seemed entirely out of character, though I kept these thoughts to myself. I'm looking forward to meeting her, I said instead. Perhaps I could come to Boston for a weekend soon? Let me check with Vanessa about our schedule, he replied, the slight hesitation in his voice triggering the faintest warning bell in my mind. She's traveling a lot for work right now, and with wedding planning on top of that, but we'll definitely arrange something before June. That something didn't materialize until late April, just 6 weeks before the wedding date, when Michael called to say they would be visiting Philadelphia that weekend. Just a quick trip. We arrive Friday evening and leave Sunday morning. Vanessa has a client meeting in the city on Friday, so we thought we'd extend it to spend some time with you. I spent 2 days preparing for their visit, cleaning the house thoroughly, planning meals based on Michael's favorites, and even arranging fresh flowers in the guest room I hoped they would use. The emotional investment in these preparations reflected not just maternal love, but a deeper hope that this relationship might reconnect me with my increasingly distant son. When they arrived Friday evening, my first impression of Vanessa was overwhelming. Tall, slender, and impeccably styled in a designer outfit that probably cost more than my monthly retirement income, she carried herself with the confident poise of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon that emphasized her striking bone structure and carefully applied makeup. "Eleanor," she greeted me, extending manicured hands rather than offering an embrace. "I've heard so much about you. Michael speaks very highly of his mother." Something in her tone, a subtle formality that created immediate distance, set off the same internal alert system that had served me well throughout my career when evaluating potentially fraudulent security situations. The smile that accompanied her words seemed practiced rather than spontaneous, not quite reaching her eyes despite its technical perfection. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Vanessa," I responded, choosing warmth over matching her reserve. "I've been looking forward to getting to know the woman who captured my son's heart." Michael hovered anxiously between us, his body language suggesting tension rather than the joyful anticipation I would have expected from a recently engaged man introducing his fiancée to his mother. He quickly suggested we move to the living room, where he immediately began discussing the convenient location of their hotel relative to Vanessa's morning meeting. "Hotel?" I questioned, unable to hide my disappointment. "I've prepared the guest room for you both." "We discussed this, Michael," Vanessa interjected before my son could respond, her tone gentle but firm. "With my early meeting and our tight schedule, the hotel makes more sense logistically." Michael nodded, avoiding my eyes. "It's just more convenient, Mom. We'll spend the day with you tomorrow after Vanessa's meeting wraps up." That evening established patterns that would characterize the entire visit. Vanessa expertly dominated conversations, redirecting topics whenever family history or personal connections arose, keeping discussions focused on wedding logistics, property values, and investment opportunities. When I mentioned Charles and how much he would have loved to see Michael married, she smoothly interjected with questions about local restaurants, effectively closing that emotional avenue. More concerning was Michael's behavior in her presence. My normally confident, articulate son seemed perpetually vigilant, watching Vanessa for subtle cues before speaking, deferring to her opinions on topics where he had previously held strong views, and repeatedly checking his phone whenever she stepped away, as though anticipating instructions or evaluation. During a rare moment alone while Vanessa took a business call outside, I gently asked about the rapid wedding timeline. "It seems very quick, Michael. Are you sure you're not feeling rushed?" A flash of something, defensiveness mixed with uncertainty, crossed his face before he composed his expression. "Vanessa is extremely organized and decisive. It's one of the things I love about her. She sees no reason to drag out the engagement when we both know what we want." "And what about what you want?" I asked carefully. The Michael I know usually takes his time with important decisions. "I've changed, Mom," he replied, an edge entering his voice. "Vanessa helps me be more efficient, less stuck in analysis paralysis. It's been good for my career, too. I'm being considered for partnership since we've been together." The link between his relationship and career advancement triggered another quiet alarm in my mind, but further conversation was prevented by Vanessa's return. She placed a proprietary hand on Michael's shoulder as she rejoined us, effectively closing our private discussion. The remainder of their visit continued in this vein. Polite but distant interactions where genuine connection seemed actively discouraged. When they departed Sunday morning, Michael embraced me briefly while Vanessa waited by their rental car, checking her watch with poorly concealed impatience. "We'll see you at the wedding, Mom," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Vanessa will email you the details and hotel information." As I watched them drive away, the locksmith in me, the professional who had spent decades identifying, when mechanisms weren't functioning as designed, couldn't ignore the evidence before me. Something in this relationship was fundamentally misaligned, operating under pressure rather than with the smooth interaction of well-matched components. What I couldn't yet determine was whether this dysfunction stemmed from normal adjustment to a new relationship or something more concerning. The detective skills Ramon had credited me with urged caution in jumping to conclusions without sufficient evidence, but the mother in me couldn't silence the persistent warning bells that had been ringing since I first met Vanessa Reynolds. 3 weeks leading to the wedding brought increased distance rather than the connection I had hoped for. Michael's calls became briefer and less frequent, often with Vanessa audibly present in the background. The wedding details arrived via impersonal email from Vanessa's account, with detailed instructions about appropriate attire, navy or gray, no bright colors, arrival times, and hotel booking information, all presented as non-negotiable directives, rather than friendly guidance. When I called Michael to ask if I might contribute to the ceremony in some way, perhaps sharing a special reading or family blessing, his response came after a muffled consultation with Vanessa. "The ceremony is already finalized," he explained, discomfort evident in his voice. "Vanessa has arranged everything with the officiant. But we appreciate the thought, Mom." 2 days before the wedding, I arrived in Boston and checked into the designated hotel, a luxury property that seemed excessive for what Michael had originally described as a small ceremony. The welcome package waiting in my room contained a meticulously detailed schedule of events, with my presence specifically requested only at the rehearsal dinner that evening and the ceremony the following day. The rehearsal dinner at an upscale restaurant near the financial district introduced me to Vanessa's parents, Harrison and Judith Reynolds, a couple whose calculated warmth mirrored their daughter's practiced charm. Harrison, I learned through dinner conversation, had recently retired from a senior position at the same financial firm where Michael worked, a connection that explained much about their introduction and perhaps the accelerated timeline of their relationship. "Michael has such potential," Harrison commented during the meal, patting my son's shoulder with proprietary approval. Vanessa recognized it immediately. "She has an eye for quality investments." The phrasing sent another ripple of unease through me, particularly when I noticed how Michael beamed at this assessment, as though validation from his future father-in-law carried more weight than any other measure of worth. Throughout the evening, I observed how the Reynolds family operated as a unit, with Vanessa clearly emulating her mother's techniques for controlling conversations and social dynamics. When I attempted to share stories about Michael's childhood achievements, his state chess championship in middle school, his compassionate work with habitat restoration in college. Vanessa smoothly redirected the conversation before I could complete any narrative that didn't align with the image being constructed of Michael as primarily a financial success story. The wedding day dawned with perfect early summer weather, sunshine highlighting the manicured grounds of Westbrook Country Club where the ceremony would take place. I arrived early as instructed, dressed in the navy sheath dress I had purchased specifically for the occasion, a simple strand of pearls, Charles's last gift before his illness, my only jewelry. A staff member directed me to the bridal preparation suite, explaining that Michael had requested I visit before the ceremony began. "Just down this hallway, third door on the right," he instructed. "The bridal party is expecting you." When I entered the elegantly appointed room, Vanessa was alone, standing near a large vanity where various cosmetics and hair tools were arranged. With military precision, she wore a silk robe over her undergarments, her wedding gown hanging nearby on a padded display form. "Eleanor," she greeted me, her surprise poorly concealed. "You're early." "The staff said Michael wanted to see me before the ceremony," I explained, immediately sensing something amiss in her reaction. "He's with his groomsmen in the East Wing," she replied, recovering quickly. "You must have misunderstood the message. He'll see you at the ceremony." Before I could respond, I noticed an overnight bag on a nearby chair, partially open to reveal documents and what appeared to be jewelry boxes. When Vanessa saw the direction of my gaze, she moved swiftly to close the bag, but not before I glimpsed what looked remarkably like Charles's antique pocket watch, a family heirloom I kept in my bedroom safe at home, one that Michael had always admired but that I had never given him. "Is everything all right?" I asked, moving slightly to keep the bag in my peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact with Vanessa. "Perfect," she assured me with practiced smoothness. "Just wedding day chaos. Actually, I was about to freshen up before dressing. Would you mind waiting in here while I check something with the coordinator?" She gestured toward an adjoining bathroom, guiding me with gentle pressure on my elbow. "The air conditioning in the main suite is acting up, but this bathroom stays nice and cool. I'll be right back to bring you to Michael." Nodding, I allowed her to usher me into the spacious bathroom with its marble countertops and ornate mirrors. As soon as the door closed behind me, I heard a distinctive sound that 42 years as a locksmith made unmistakable: the quiet but deliberate jamming of a lock mechanism. I stood frozen for a moment, the unmistakable sound of the lock being tampered with echoing in my mind. 42 years of locksmith work had trained my ears to recognize the deliberate sabotage of a door mechanism. This wasn't an accidental locking. Vanessa had intentionally jammed the bathroom door to keep me confined. My first reaction wasn't panic, but rather a strange sense of validation. The subtle warning signals I'd been noticing since meeting Vanessa suddenly crystallized into a clear pattern of deception. As I approached the door to examine the lock, my thoughts turned to my father, Arthur Bennett, who had first introduced me to the world of locks and security when I was just a young girl. Dad had been a locksmith in Philadelphia during the post-war years, running a small shop that specialized in both traditional key locks and the newer security systems that were becoming popular in the 1950s. Some of my earliest memories were of sitting on a high stool in his workshop, watching his skilled hands manipulate tiny pins and springs with remarkable precision. "Security isn't just about keeping bad people out, Ellie," he often told me while working. "It's about understanding how people think, what motivates them. A lock is a psychological barrier as much as a physical one." My father believed that understanding security made you more secure, not just physically but emotionally. He raised me to observe carefully, to notice patterns, and to trust my instincts when something seemed out of place. These lessons had served me well throughout my life, particularly when I unexpectedly followed in his footsteps after his sudden death from a heart attack the year after I married Charles. The locksmith shop had been my inheritance, though I'd never planned to run it myself. Charles and I had initially discussed selling the business to fund our future plans. but when I stepped into the shop to assess its value, something resonated within me. The familiar smells of metal and oil, the orderly rows of key blanks, the workbench where I'd spent countless hours watching my father work. "I think I want to try running it," I told Charles that evening, surprising both of us with the declaration. "Just for a while, to honor Dad's legacy before we sell." That while turned into 4 decades. Charles had supported my decision completely, helping with the accounting aspects while building his dental practice. "You have your father's hands," he observed, after watching me disassemble and repair a complex safe lock during my first year running the shop. "And his eyes. You see things others miss. Those skills, the ability to see beyond surfaces and understand hidden mechanisms, were precisely what I needed now as I examined the bathroom door lock. Crouching down, I could see that Vanessa had inserted something into the keyhole from the outside, likely a broken key or similar object, effectively jamming the lock mechanism. This wasn't an amateur's work. She had deliberately disabled it in a way that would appear accidental if questioned later. "Oh dear, these old doors can be so temperamental," I could almost hear her saying to concerned guests or staff. Meanwhile, I would be conveniently absent from my son's wedding ceremony. As I assessed the damaged lock, another memory surfaced. This one of teaching 10-year-old Michael the basics of lock mechanisms during a school vacation when he had accompanied me to the shop. Unlike many children who might have quickly grown, bored with the technical details, Michael had been fascinated, absorbing information about pins, drivers, and shear lines with remarkable comprehension. "Every lock has a weakness, Mom," he had observed after successfully picking his first practice lock. "You just have to know where to look for it." "That's true," I had agreed. "But understanding that weakness is what helps us build better security. Knowledge is protection, Michael." I wondered now what had happened to that observant, thoughtful boy who understood that vulnerabilities weren't to be exploited, but rather protected. Somewhere in his journey to adulthood, Michael seemed to have lost the ability to recognize when he himself was being manipulated, or perhaps he had chosen to ignore the warning signs in pursuit of whatever Vanessa represented to him. Taking a deep breath, I focused on the immediate problem. The jammed lock wouldn't yield to normal manipulation, but the bathroom's design offered other possibilities. The elegant space featured a large window overlooking a secluded garden area. The window was designed to tilt open for ventilation, not wide enough for most adults to crawl through. But I had always been small-framed, an advantage in many locksmith jobs that required reaching into tight spaces. Before attempting the window, I did what decades of professional experience had taught me to do first. I thoroughly assessed my surroundings for all possible resources and options. The bathroom was luxuriously appointed with thick towels, crystal containers of hand soap and lotion, and a decorative basket containing various toiletries and emergency supplies for wedding guests, including, I noticed with satisfaction, several bobby pins and a metal nail file. These simple items had been the beginning tools of my locksmith training. My father had shown me how to reshape a bobby pin into a tension wrench when I was just 12 years old. "Most locks aren't defeated with fancy tools, Ellie," he'd explained. "They surrender to patience and improvisation." I briefly considered trying to defeat the jammed lock using these makeshift tools, but quickly recognized that Vanessa's sabotage would make this approach time-consuming and potentially unsuccessful. The window offered a more immediate escape route, and time seemed crucial given what I had glimpsed in her overnight bag, particularly what appeared to be Charles's pocket watch that should have been securely stored in my home. Checking my watch, I realized that the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin in just 45 minutes. If I was going to investigate further and potentially intervene, I needed to act quickly. Moving the small vanity bench beneath the window, I carefully climbed up and examined the window mechanism. It was designed to tilt inward for cleaning and ventilation, with a limit chain to prevent it from opening fully. Years of working with security systems had taught me that most restriction mechanisms have override features for maintenance and emergency purposes. Sure enough, the window's limit chain had a small release clip that would allow the window to open completely. Within moments, I had disengaged it and pushed the window outward, creating an opening just large enough for a person of my size to squeeze through. The drop to the garden below was about 6 feet. Manageable, but not without risk for someone my age. I arranged several thick towels on the ground below the window to cushion my landing, then carefully eased myself through the opening, hanging briefly by my hands from the windowsill before dropping as gently as possible onto the makeshift landing. The impact sent a jolt through my knees and hips, but nothing seemed injured as I cautiously rose to my feet and straightened my navy dress. I found myself in a small decorative garden adjacent to the bridal suite, partially concealed from the main grounds by ornamental shrubbery. This seclusion was fortunate, as it allowed me to collect myself without immediately being spotted by wedding guests who might be arriving. My first instinct was to find Michael, to warn him about Vanessa's suspicious behavior and the items I had glimpsed in her bag. But professional experience cautioned against acting on incomplete information. Throughout my career, I had seen the consequences of security assumptions made without sufficient evidence. Verify before alarming had been one of my business principles, saving clients from both unnecessary panic and potential embarrassment. On numerous occasions, I needed to confirm what I had seen in Vanessa's bag, particularly the watch that resembled Charles's heirloom, before confronting my son on his wedding day with accusations against his bride. The bridal suite had a terrace, door that likely led back into the same room where I had left Vanessa. If she had departed to check on wedding preparations as she'd claimed, I might have a brief opportunity to investigate. Moving cautiously along the garden path, I approached the terrace and peered through the glass doors. The suite appeared empty, with Vanessa's wedding gown still hanging on its display form, and her personal items scattered across the vanity. The overnight bag sat where I had seen it earlier, partially open on a brocade chair. The terrace door was unlocked, a careless oversight that suggested Vanessa had left in a hurry, perhaps to ensure I was safely contained or to complete whatever plans required my absence. I slipped quietly into the room and moved directly to the bag, my heart pounding with a mixture of investigative determination and maternal concern about what I might discover. Opening the bag fully revealed contents that confirmed my worst suspicions. There was indeed Charles's antique pocket watch, the 1923 Illinois Bun Special that had been passed down through his family for generations, with his grandfather's initials engraved on the case. Beside it lay several pieces of my own jewelry, including my mother's sapphire ring that I kept in my bedroom safe at home. More disturbing were the documents neatly organized in a leather portfolio, financial statements from my accounts, property, deeds to my home, and what appeared to be draft power of attorney documents with my signature, a signature I immediately recognized as forged, though skillfully so. My years of examining document security for bank clients had trained me to spot even sophisticated forgeries, and these were clearly attempts to access my assets without my knowledge. Also in the bag was a small notebook containing what appeared to be a detailed timeline. Scanning the entries, I felt a chill of recognition as I read notations like, E's house listed after honeymoon, transfer remaining accounts by September, and most alarmingly, assisted living tour, OCT, tell M necessary for safety. This wasn't merely theft. It was a comprehensive plan to systematically strip me of my assets and independence, apparently with the intention of convincing Michael it was for my own good. The cold calculation evident in these materials explained Vanessa's insistence on rushing the wedding and her efforts to separate me from Michael during their visits. As I carefully photographed these items with my phone, another habit from my security work, I heard voices approaching from the hallway. Quickly returning everything to its original position, I slipped back onto the terrace and partially closed the door behind me, positioning myself behind a large potted plant where I could observe without being immediately visible. Vanessa entered, with her mother, their conversation confirming everything the documents had suggested. "Is she secured?" Judith Reynolds asked, her voice low but clear through the partially open door. "Completely," Vanessa replied with casual confidence. "I jammed the bathroom lock. By the time anyone finds her, we'll be legally married and halfway through the reception. Michael won't leave in the middle of everything. He's too concerned with appearances. And you're sure he has no idea about the financial arrangements?" Her mother pressed, helping Vanessa remove the robe as they prepared to start dressing for the ceremony. "None. He signed everything I put in front of him last week. Full access to his accounts, joint property ownership, even the amended trust documents. Once we're married, we'll have complete control over his assets, and, through him, Eleanor's estate as well. Harrison says the timing is perfect," Judith continued, retrieving the wedding gown from its display. "The market position he's arranged for Michael will collapse within 6 months, by which time we'll have transferred the majority of their assets into our protected accounts offshore. Michael will never even realize what happened," Vanessa said with a cold laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "He'll think it was just market volatility, and by then, we'll have secured Eleanor's property as safety net. She's sitting on almost $2 million in assets between the house, investments, and insurance from her husband." The casual cruelty with which they discussed defrauding both me and my son ignited something protective and resolute within me. This wasn't simply about my own security anymore. Michael was being victimized by people who had carefully studied his vulnerabilities and were exploiting them systematically. I needed to act quickly, but strategically. Confronting Vanessa directly would likely lead to denials and potentially create a situation where I appeared to be an irrational, interfering mother. The documents alone, while suspicious, might not be immediately convincing to Michael, who seemed thoroughly manipulated and emotionally invested in his relationship with Vanessa. As I carefully retreated from my hiding place, planning my next move, I thought of another lesson my father had taught me during my locksmith apprenticeship. When you discover a security breach, your first move isn't to confront the intruder, it's to secure what's valuable and alert those who can provide proper intervention. In this case, what was most valuable was my son's future and the family legacy that Vanessa and her parents were attempting to steal. The proper intervention would require evidence and authority that would be difficult to dismiss or manipulate. Making my way around the building through the garden paths, I avoided the main entrance where guests would be arriving and instead sought a service entrance that would allow me to access the venue without immediately being noticed. My navy dress, chosen to be appropriately understated for the mother of the groom, now served as excellent camouflage among the staff areas, where several people in dark clothing were bustling with last-minute preparations. Finding a quiet corner in a service hallway, I pulled out my phone and called the one person whose judgment and authority I trusted completely in this situation, Officer Martinez. Our weekly chess games had evolved into a deep friendship over the years, and his background as a detective made him uniquely qualified to help navigate this situation. "Ramon," I said when he answered, keeping my voice low. "I need your help at Westbrook Country Club. It's an emergency involving fraud, theft, and identity forgery." To his credit, Ramon asked only essential questions: where exactly I was located, whether I was in immediate danger, and what evidence I had observed. After my concise explanation, he responded with the calm efficiency that had likely characterized his police career. "Stay somewhere safe but accessible. I'll be there in 15 minutes with a colleague who's still on active duty. Document everything you've seen, but don't confront anyone before we arrive." While waiting, I composed a detailed note on my phone, recording everything I had observed and overheard, with timestamps and specific descriptions that would hold up to scrutiny. This methodical documentation was another habit from my professional life. The security breach you document properly is the only one you can prove later, as my father used to say. I also took a moment to reflect on the values that had guided my life and the lessons I had tried to impart to Michael throughout his childhood. Charles and I had always emphasized integrity, transparency, and the importance of genuine connection over material success. Somewhere along the way, Michael had become vulnerable to people who embodied the opposite of these values, people who viewed relationships as transactions and others' trust as a weakness to be exploited. This realization brought not just anger, but profound sadness. Had we failed as parents to truly instill those core values? Or had the environment of his adult life simply eroded them gradually until he could no longer recognize their absence in others? These questions would need addressing eventually, but for now, Michael needed protection from predators who had identified and targeted his vulnerabilities with frightening precision. Ramon arrived with remarkable promptness, accompanied by Detective Sarah Knowles, a serious-looking woman in her 40s who carried herself with quiet authority. After reviewing the photos I had taken and listening to my account, they agreed that there was sufficient cause for immediate investigation. Financial elder abuse is a serious crime, Detective Knowles explained, as is forgery and theft. The evidence you've gathered gives us probable cause to intervene before the ceremony. My primary concern is my son, I emphasized. He's being manipulated and defrauded as well, though he doesn't realize it yet. Ramon nodded, his expression compassionate but determined. The most effective approach will be to contain and question the Reynolds family before the ceremony begins, rather than creating a scene during the wedding itself. The evidence in Vanessa's overnight bag is key. We need to secure it before they have a chance to dispose of anything. Their professional approach reassured me. Throughout my career, I had worked with law enforcement on numerous security cases, and I recognized the methodical preparation that characterized effective intervention. Detective Knowles made several brief calls, apparently arranging for additional officers to position themselves discreetly around the venue. "We'll need you to identify the parties involved," she told me as we moved toward the main building, "but please allow us to handle the confrontation. Your role now is as witness and complainant, not enforcer." This instruction aligned perfectly with professional protocols I had followed throughout my career when discovering security breaches. My responsibility had always been to identify vulnerabilities and alert proper authorities, then step back and allow them to address the situation according to established procedures. As we approached the bridal suite area, I spotted Michael in the distance, surrounded by his groomsmen in the garden where photographs were being taken. He looked handsome in his formal attire, but noticeably tense, his smile stiff and his posture rigid in a way that spoke of anxiety rather than anticipation. Seeing him this way, manipulated and unaware of the danger he faced, strengthened my resolve to protect him, even if he initially resisted that protection. Detective Knowles positioned 2 officers near the garden area, while she and Ramon accompanied me toward the bridal suite. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in just 20 minutes, with guests already being seated in the garden pavilion visible through the large windows at the end of the hallway. As we reached the bridal suite door, I hesitated briefly. A lifetime of social conditioning about not making scenes, momentarily conflicting with the protective determination that had guided me through this discovery. Ramon seemed to sense my hesitation and placed a reassuring hand briefly on my shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor," he said quietly. "This isn't interfering. It's preventing a crime and protecting your family." His words resonated with the core values my father had instilled in me and that Charles and I had tried to pass on to Michael. Security wasn't just about locks and alarm systems. It was about protecting what matters through vigilance, courage, and decisive action when threats were identified. Detective Knowles knocked firmly on the suite door, her badge already in hand. After a brief pause, the door opened to reveal Judith Reynolds, already dressed in a formal gown with her hair and makeup impeccably styled. Her expression shifted quickly from irritation at the interruption to careful neutrality when she noticed the badge. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Detective Knowles asked, her tone professionally neutral. "I'm Detective Sarah Knowles with Boston PD. We need To speak with you and your daughter immediately regarding some serious concerns that have been brought to our attention. There must be some mistake, Judith replied smoothly, attempting to close the door slightly. My daughter is preparing for her wedding ceremony, which begins in minutes. Whatever this is about will need to wait until tomorrow. I'm afraid this cannot wait, Detective Knowles replied, her foot subtly preventing the door from closing further. It concerns evidence of financial fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny currently located in this room. From within the suite, I heard Vanessa's voice sharp with alarm. Mother, what's happening? Before Judith could respond, Detective Knowles firmly pushed the door open wider, revealing her official capacity more clearly. Ms. Reynolds, I have a warrant to search this room based on documented evidence of stolen property and fraudulent documents in your possession. I need both of you to step aside immediately. The shock on Judith's face quickly transformed into calculated assessment, the look of someone rapidly evaluating options and identifying potential exits. It was an expression I had seen on the faces of sophisticated security system testers. Throughout my career, individuals who made their living by finding vulnerabilities in supposedly impenetrable defenses. This is outrageous, she declared, her voice rising strategically to attract attention. We're in the middle of wedding preparations. Whatever accusations have been made are clearly misunderstandings that can be addressed after the ceremony. Ramon had positioned himself near the overnight bag I had identified, his experienced eyes never leaving it even as the confrontation at the door continued. When Vanessa emerged from the adjoining dressing area, now fully attired in her wedding gown, her expression shifted from confusion to recognition when she saw me standing beside Detective Knowles. You, she hissed, her carefully cultivated poise cracking momentarily to reveal the calculating individual beneath. How did you get out of the bathroom? Her inadvertent admission silenced her mother's protests momentarily, creating an opening that Detective Knowles immediately utilized. Ms. Reynolds, that statement suggests you knowingly imprisoned Mrs. Blackwood, which adds false imprisonment to the charges we're investigating. I strongly advise you to remain silent until you've consulted with an attorney. While this exchange unfolded, Ramon had opened the overnight bag and methodically documented its contents, photographing each item in place before carefully removing them to an evidence collection bag he had brought. The reappearance of Charles's pocket watch and my mother's ring, both clearly identifiable as stolen property, provided immediate visual confirmation of my allegations. These items are confirmed stolen from Mrs. Blackwood's residence, Ramon stated formally, his voice carrying the authority of his many years in law enforcement. And these documents appear to contain multiple forged signatures and evidence of an ongoing financial fraud scheme. The methodical, professional manner in which Ramon and Detective Knowles managed the situation reminded me of how Charles and I had approached challenges throughout our marriage, with calm thoroughness rather than reactive emotion. We had tried to model this approach for Michael, emphasizing that effective problem-solving required clear assessment and appropriate response rather than impulsive reaction. As Detective Knowles began formally advising Judith and Vanessa of their rights, another officer appeared at the door with Harrison Reynolds, whose imperious demands for explanation quickly subsided when he saw the evidence being cataloged by Ramon. I think we should contact our attorney, he said quietly to his wife and daughter, his businessman's instinct for damage control apparently overriding any impulse to protest further. The scene had attracted attention from nearby staff and wedding party members, creating a growing cluster of onlookers in the hallway. Among them, I spotted Michael pushing his way forward, his expression transitioning from confusion to alarm as he took in the official police presence and the evidence collection occurring in the bridal suite. "Mom?" he called out, his voice catching slightly as he approached. "What's happening? Why are the police here?" Meeting my son's confused gaze, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: protective determination, sympathy for the painful awakening he was about to experience, and a fundamental, Certainty that revealing difficult truths was an act of love rather than interference. This moment would likely change his life trajectory dramatically, but that change was necessary to protect him from people who had targeted him precisely because of his trusting nature. "Michael," I began, moving toward him while the officers continued their work with the Reynolds family. "There's something you need to see." Michael's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as I guided him away from the growing commotion at the bridal suite, finding a quiet alcove where we could speak privately. His formal wedding attire, the classic black tuxedo he'd chosen months ago, now seemed like costume for a role he'd been unwittingly playing. "Mom, what's going on?" he demanded, his voice strained with tension. "Why are the police arresting Vanessa's family on our wedding day?" The hurt and bewilderment in his eyes made this moment even more difficult than I had anticipated. Throughout his childhood, Charles and I had tried to protect Michael from painful truths while still preparing him to face life's inevitable disappointments. Now, I had to shatter his carefully constructed future in order to save him from exploitation by those who had identified and targeted his vulnerabilities. "Michael, please sit down," I said gently, gesturing to a nearby bench. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be shocking and painful, but it's necessary for your protection." He remained standing, arms crossed defensively. "Protection from what? My fiancé? The woman I love and was about to marry in 20 minutes? Taking a deep breath, I chose directness over gentle introduction. 4 decades of security consulting had taught me that when delivering critical information, clarity trumps comfort. Vanessa and her parents have been systematically planning to defraud both of us, Michael. I discovered evidence in her possession. Stolen. Family heirlooms from my home, forged documents with my signature, and detailed plans to transfer our assets to offshore accounts. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible. You must be mistaken." Rather than arguing, I showed him the photos I had taken of the contents of Vanessa's bag, Charles's pocket watch, my mother's ring, and the notebook detailing their plans. "These items were stolen from my home safe, Michael. The notebook contains explicit plans to list my house after your honeymoon and transfer my accounts by September. There's even an entry about touring assisted living facilities for me in October." I paused, letting the evidence speak for itself. The police also found forged power of attorney documents with my signature. Michael took my phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the images with increasing distress. When he reached the notebook entries, he sat heavily on the bench, shock evident in every line of his body. "This can't be real," he whispered, though his tone suggested he was already beginning to accept the terrible truth. "We've been together for almost 2 years. She knows everything about my life, my work, my finances." "That's exactly the problem," I said gently, sitting beside him. "She and her family targeted you specifically because of your position and access to assets. They've been planning this for much longer than you realize." As the reality began to sink in, Michael's breathing became uneven, his hands clenching into fists. "I gave her access to everything," he admitted, voice barely audible. "Joint accounts, investment portfolios, even amended my will last month at her suggestion." This revelation confirmed my worst fears about how thoroughly he had been manipulated. The Michael I had raised had always been methodical and cautious with financial matters. These impulsive decisions revealed how completely Vanessa had overridden his natural inclinations. "How did you discover this?" he asked after a long moment, his professional training apparently helping him focus on facts rather than emotions, at least temporarily. I explained the sequence of events, being locked in the bathroom, my escape, through the window, and the conversation I'd overheard between Vanessa and her mother. As I spoke, I could see him processing the information, his analytical mind reconstructing patterns he had previously missed or dismissed. "They've been isolating you from me," he realized aloud. "Every time you suggested visiting Boston, Vanessa would find a reason why the timing wasn't right. When you offered to help with wedding planning, she insisted on handling everything herself, even your calls to me. She always seemed to be there, monitoring our conversations. His growing awareness of how he had been manipulated triggered my memory of a similar conversation with my father decades earlier, when he had helped a wealthy client discover that his charismatic business partner had been systematically embezzling funds. I trusted him completely, the client had admitted, shame evident in his voice. He was so confident, so persuasive. I never thought to verify what he told me. My father's response had shaped my understanding of both security and human vulnerability. Trust is necessary for society to function, Mr. Lawson. The shame belongs to those who exploit it, not those who extend it. Now you'll verify more carefully, but don't let this experience destroy your capacity to trust worthy people. I shared this wisdom with Michael now, wanting him to understand that his trusting nature wasn't a flaw to be eliminated, but rather a quality to be protected with better discernment. Your father always saw the best in people too, I told him, my hand covering his. It's one of the qualities I loved most about him, and about you. The solution isn't to become cynical, but to develop better awareness of when that trust might be misplaced. Michael nodded slowly, though the devastation in his eyes suggested emotional processing would take far longer than intellectual understanding. All those guests out there, he said, gesturing toward the ceremony space visible through a distant window. Everyone from my firm, colleagues, friends. How do I tell them that my bride and her family were arrested for fraud on our wedding day? The practical question seemed to ground him, providing a concrete problem to solve rather than dwelling on the emotional betrayal. It reminded me of how Charles had coped with difficult situations throughout our marriage, focusing on necessary actions before allowing himself to fully process painful feelings. The truth is usually best, I advised, drawing on my experience, helping clients address security breaches. A simple statement that unforeseen circumstances have required postponing the ceremony, followed by private explanations to close friends when you're ready. Detective Knowles mentioned they would be discreet about the arrests, avoiding the ceremony area. As we discussed these immediate logistical concerns, Ramon appeared at the entrance to our alcove, his expression conveying both professional efficiency and personal compassion. Michael, I'm Ramon Martinez, a friend of your mother's, he introduced himself. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Detective Knowles would like to speak with you briefly about the financial documents they've discovered. When you're ready, of course. Michael straightened, smoothing his tuxedo jacket in a gesture that seemed to help him regain composure. I'll speak with her now. The sooner we understand the extent of this situation, the better. As he rose to follow Ramon, Michael turned back to me, his expression shifting from shock to a more complex emotion I couldn't immediately identify. You saved me from making a terrible mistake, he said quietly. Thank you for being brave enough to intervene, even knowing I might not believe you initially. The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Michael had often bristled against our protective guidance, particularly during his rebellious teenage years. To hear him recognize and appreciate that protection now, as an adult, created a moment of connection that transcended the painful circumstances. That's what family does, I replied simply. We protect each other, even when it's difficult. The hours that followed passed in a blur of police statements, guest notifications, and difficult conversations with Michael's closest friends who had been invited to stay while the venue staff discreetly informed other guests of the ceremony's cancellation. Harrison Reynolds's connections had apparently enabled significant financial manipulations that extended beyond simple fraud into potential securities violations, resulting in all three Reynolds family members being taken to police headquarters for further questioning. By early evening, the venue had emptied of guests, leaving only Michael, myself, and two of his closest friends from college who had insisted on remaining for moral support. We sat in what should have been the reception area, surrounded by elegant floral arrangements and place settings that now served as painful reminders of the celebration that wouldn't occur. I can't believe I missed all the warning signs, Michael, said, loosening his bow tie and staring into the untouched glass of scotch one of his friends had poured him. Looking back, they seem so obvious now. Sophisticated predators are experts at making red flags seem like normal behavior, I explained, drawing on my professional experience with security breaches. They gradually normalize things that would be concerning if they happened all at once. His friend David, a psychologist who had driven from New York for the wedding, nodded in agreement. It's called incremental boundary testing. Each small violation gets accepted, making the next one seem less significant by comparison. Before you realize it, you've accepted a completely abnormal situation because the progression happened so gradually. This professional perspective seemed to help Michael process his experience more objectively, reducing some of the self-recrimination that had been evident in his earlier comments. Throughout his childhood, Michael had always responded better to explanations than to simple reassurance. Understanding the why behind experiences helped him integrate them more effectively. As the evening progressed, Michael made necessary calls to his office, arranging for emergency leave to address the financial and legal complications that would inevitably follow. His firm's security team would need to investigate whether Vanessa had accessed sensitive client information, adding professional concerns to the personal betrayal he was processing. When his friends finally departed after ensuring we had transportation, arranged back to my hotel, Michael and I found ourselves alone among the abandoned wedding decorations. The silence between us felt weighted with unasked questions and incomplete realizations about how this experience would reshape our relationship moving forward. "Would you have said something if you hadn't found the evidence?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the elaborate wedding cake that would never be cut. "If you had just felt something was wrong with Vanessa, would you have tried to stop the wedding?" The question cut to the heart of our complicated mother-son dynamic over the years, my protective instincts often conflicting with his need for independence and self-determination. Throughout his adulthood, I had been careful to offer opinions, only when explicitly asked, respecting the boundaries he had established as he built his own life. "I had concerns from our first meeting," I admitted, choosing honesty over comfort. "But no, I wouldn't have intervened without concrete evidence. I've always tried to respect your right to make your own choices, even when I didn't fully agree with them." He nodded slowly, seemingly appreciating both my candor and the respect for his autonomy it represented. "I've been thinking about Dad today," he said after another long silence, "about how he taught me to evaluate people by their actions rather than their words or appearances." The reference to Charles's wisdom brought a bittersweet smile to my face. My late husband had indeed emphasized this principle throughout Michael's upbringing, often pointing out discrepancies between what people claimed and how they actually behaved. "He would have seen through Vanessa immediately," Michael continued, regret evident in his voice. "He always had that ability to sense when someone wasn't authentic." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but he would never want you to blame yourself for not having the same instincts. We developed different strengths, Michael. Your father and I balanced each other, his people instincts complementing my technical skills." As we finally prepared to leave the venue, Michael surprised me by asking if I would consider returning to Boston with him, rather than going back to Philadelphia immediately as planned. "I know you have your routines at home, but I could use your help sorting through this financial mess. Vanessa had access to everything. We need to secure accounts, change passwords, possibly freeze credit reports." The request touched me deeply, not just because it acknowledged my professional expertise, but because it represented a willingness to collaborate that had been missing from our relationship in recent years. Michael had always been fiercely independent, often refusing assistance even when it would have been beneficial. This openness to working together signaled a potential shift in our dynamic that transcended the immediate crisis. "Of course I'll stay," I assured him, "however long you need." The following days established new patterns in our relationship as we worked together to untangle the financial web Vanessa and her parents had created. My locksmith background had naturally evolved to include broader security consulting over the years, particularly in document verification and access management, skills that proved invaluable as we methodically reviewed every account and document. Vanessa might have compromised. Michael's downtown Boston apartment, the condominium he had shared with Vanessa for the past year, initially felt like entering hostile territory. Her presence lingered in the carefully selected decor, the organized closets, and the sophisticated kitchen gadgets she had insisted were essential. Police had already collected her personal effects as part of their investigation, but the aesthetic choices that reflected her influence remained. "I can't stay here," Michael admitted on our first night back, standing in the center of the living room with its panoramic city views. "Everything reminds me of her." "Then we'll find somewhere else," I responded practically. "A short-term rental while you decide what you want to do longer term." By the following afternoon, we had secured a furnished two-bedroom apartment in a residential neighborhood across the Charles River in Cambridge, a completely different environment from the sleek financial district condominium. The smaller, more casual space with its bookshelves and vintage features provided neutral territory where we could address the practical and emotional aftermath of the wedding that wasn't. Working side by side at the apartment's dining table, we methodically rebuilt Michael's financial security, changing account access, reviewing recent transactions for unauthorized transfers, and documenting everything for the ongoing criminal investigation. The process reminded me of projects we had tackled together during his childhood, assembling complex models or solving mechanical puzzles that required concentration and collaboration. "You're still using the same password pattern you created in high school," I observed with mild disapproval after helping him reset access to several accounts. "That's dangerous, Michael," he laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard since the wedding day disaster. "Some habits are hard to break. Remember how you used to make me change the lock combination on my bicycle every month to develop good security hygiene? And you complained every single time," I recalled, smiling at the memory. "But you never had your bike stolen, unlike most of your friends." These moments of connection through shared history became increasingly frequent as we settled into our temporary routine. The professional focus on security and recovery provided a framework that allowed more personal conversations to emerge naturally without feeling forced or therapeutic. On our fourth evening in Cambridge, as we reviewed police reports about the items recovered from Vanessa's possession, Michael finally asked the question that had clearly been troubling him since the wedding day. "How did they get into your house, Mom? The items they stole were in your safe. Did they break in?" His concern was evident in the tension that immediately appeared in his shoulders. I had been anticipating this question, knowing it would likely trigger guilt once he understood the full circumstances. "They didn't break in," I explained gently. "Vanessa used the spare key you keep on your keyring, the one you've had since college." Michael's expression crumpled as the implication registered. "I gave her my keys one day when she was meeting me after work. She said she had a headache and wanted to wait in my apartment. She must have made copies then." The realization that he had unwittingly provided access to my home clearly devastated him. "You couldn't have known," I assured him, reaching across the table to cover his hand with mine. "That's what makes betrayal so painful. It exploits trust that was given in good faith." My response echoed the wisdom Charles and I had tried to instill throughout Michael's childhood, that maintaining the capacity for trust was more important than preventing every possible breach. We had emphasized that while practical security measures were essential, becoming paralyzed by suspicion damaged one's ability to form meaningful connections. "I'm changing all your locks when we get back to Philadelphia," Michael declared firmly, "and installing a proper security system with cameras." Rather than pointing out that I was perfectly capable of managing my own home security, having spent decades in the field, I recognized his need to take protective action as part of processing his role in what had happened. "I'd appreciate that," I said simply, acknowledging both his expertise and his need to make amends, however unnecessary. As days stretched into weeks, the legal proceedings against the Reynolds family revealed a pattern of similar schemes spanning multiple states and victims. Vanessa, whose real name turned out to be Victoria Simmons, had previous identities and relationships that followed remarkably similar trajectories, targeting successful professionals with substantial assets and few close family connections. Ferke. Scale of their operation shocked even Detective Knowles, who had initially suspected a relatively isolated case of opportunistic fraud. "They were sophisticated," she explained during one of our follow-up meetings at the police station. Harrison Reynolds, or Harold Simmons to use his actual name, had legitimate banking credentials from earlier in his career before being disbarred for ethical violations in Florida. That gave them credibility in financial circles that opened doors. Learning these details helped Michael process his experience less as a personal failure of judgment and more as an encounter with practiced criminals who had refined their techniques through multiple iterations. The systematic nature of their approach explained how they had so effectively identified and exploited his specific vulnerabilities. His desire for partnership with someone who understood his professional world, his tendency toward privacy that limited outside perspectives, and his trust in apparent expertise. The most painful revelation came 3 weeks after the wedding day, when forensic accounting discovered that Vanessa had already begun transferring funds from Michael's investment accounts to offshore holdings, small amounts designed to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but totaling nearly $200,000 over the previous 6 months. "She told me she was diversifying my portfolio based on her father's insider knowledge of market trends," Michael explained, staring at the transaction records spread across our temporary dining table. "I never questioned it because the documentation she showed me seemed legitimate, and her father's position at the firm gave him access to information that seemed valuable. This financial betrayal seemed to affect him more deeply than even the personal deception. Perhaps because it represented a professional blind spot that contradicted his self-image as a careful financial analyst." Throughout his career, Michael had prided himself on thorough due diligence and risk assessment, values I had observed in him since childhood, when he would research products extensively before spending his allowance. "I violated every principle I enforce with my clients," he said quietly, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "I trusted without verifying, accepted documentation without confirming sources, and allowed emotional attachment to override professional judgment." The self-criticism worried me. Throughout his childhood, Michael had always been harder on himself than anyone else could be, holding himself to sometimes impossible standards. Charles had recognized this tendency early, often reminding our son that mistakes are only failures if you don't learn from them. "You're approaching this as though professional and personal protocols should be identical," I pointed out, drawing on my own experience, balancing security consciousness with normal human connection. "But they're not, Michael. Intimate relationships require vulnerability that would be inappropriate in business contexts. The failure here wasn't yours. It was people who deliberately exploited that necessary vulnerability." My perspective seemed to resonate, allowing him to view his experience through a more nuanced lens that acknowledged both the legitimate trust required in personal relationships and the extraordinary measures the Reynolds family had taken to exploit that trust. This framing helped shift his focus from self-recrimination toward more productive consideration of how to better protect himself in the future without becoming completely closed to potential connection. As the 1-month mark approached since the wedding that wasn't practical matters regarding Michael's return to work and my eventual return to Philadelphia required discussion. We had settled into a comfortable routine in the Cambridge apartment, our collaboration on addressing the financial and legal aftermath, creating a foundation for reconnection that transcended the circumstances that necessitated it. One evening, as we walked along the Charles River after dinner, Michael broached the subject that had been implicit in our recent conversations. "I've been thinking about making a significant change," he said, watching a rowing team glide past on the darkening water. "The firm has offered a transfer to their Philadelphia office if I want it. Lower position initially, but similar compensation." The possibility of Michael returning to Philadelphia, to a location just 30 minutes from my home, created a surge of hope I tried to moderate in my response. Throughout his adulthood, I had been careful to avoid placing expectations on his geographic choices, respecting his need to build a life independent of proximity to family. "That would be a substantial transition," I observed neutrally. "What's prompting you to consider it?" He was quiet for several steps before responding. "This experience has clarified some priorities. I've been advancing professionally but increasingly isolated personally. Boston was Vanessa's territory. She controlled my social connections here, gradually separating me from colleagues and friends who weren't part of her plans. This insight reflected growing awareness I had observed throughout our time working together, Michael increasingly recognizing how systematically Vanessa had isolated him from potential support systems that might have identified her manipulation earlier. "Philadelphia has people who knew me before my identity became primarily about financial success," he continued. "School friends who valued me for reasons unrelated to my portfolio or position. And you're there, the person who saw through the deception when everyone else was fooled." The acknowledgement touched me deeply, though I was careful not to let my personal desires influence his decision. "Those are valid considerations," I agreed. "Just be certain you're moving toward something meaningful rather than simply away from painful associations." He nodded thoughtfully, a habit he had inherited from Charles, who similarly processed important decisions through physical movement and conversation. "I've been asking myself what Dad would advise," he admitted. "He always emphasized building a complete life, not just a successful career. I think I lost sight of that balance somewhere along the way." The reference to Charles's wisdom created a moment of connection that transcended our current circumstances, linking back to family values that had shaped both our lives. My late husband had indeed prioritized balanced living above singular achievement, often reminding Michael during his achievement-focused adolescence that a wealthy man with no one to share it with is still impoverished in the ways that matter most. "Your father would want you to make decisions based on authentic values rather than reaction to recent events," I suggested, echoing guidance Charles might have offered. "Take time to rediscover what those values are before making significant changes." Michael smiled, recognition in his expression. "That sounds exactly like something he would say. And you're right. I need to be deliberate rather than reactive." As our walk continued, the conversation shifted to more immediate logistics: when I would return to Philadelphia, how we would coordinate on ongoing legal matters, and what security improvements were needed for both our homes. The practical focus provided comfortable territory after the more emotionally charged discussion of his potential relocation. Later that evening, as we prepared for sleep in our temporary apartment, Michael paused at my bedroom door. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for saving me from a disastrous marriage, but for these weeks afterward. For helping me rebuild without judgment about how I got here." The gratitude in his expression carried echoes of the little boy who had once thanked me for fixing his broken bicycle chain or helping with difficult homework. Moments of vulnerability where assistance was both needed and appreciated. But there was something new as well. An adult recognition of chosen support, rather than obligatory parental help. "That's what family means," I replied, echoing what I had told him on the wedding day. "We protect each other and help rebuild when necessary. No judgment required." As he nodded and turned toward his own room, I found myself reflecting on how Crisis often reveals the true foundation of relationships. The structures we build during calm periods, the routines, assumptions, and comfortable patterns, can mask underlying strengths or weaknesses that only become visible when those structures are stressed or broken. The wedding day disaster had shattered many things: Michael's trust, his immediate future plans, his professional confidence, but it had also revealed the resilient foundation of our family connection that remained intact beneath years of distance and independent living. That foundation, built through decades of consistent presence and genuine care, had proven strong enough to support reconstruction even after significant damage. As I prepared for bed in the quiet Cambridge apartment, I thought about the security, principles that had guided my professional life. How the most effective systems weren't those that prevented all attempted breaches, but rather those resilient enough to detect intrusions and recover functionality afterward. Perhaps family relationships operated on similar principles, their strength measured not by an absence of challenges, but by the capacity to restore connection when damage occurred. This perspective brought unexpected comfort as I considered both: the painful event that had necessitated our current collaboration, and the healing that had begun through working together to address its aftermath. Whatever decisions Michael ultimately made about his location and future, the foundation for ongoing connection had been strengthened rather than weakened by this experience. A paradoxical outcome from what had initially seemed an unmitigated disaster. The following morning brought news from Detective Knowles that would further reshape our understanding of recent events. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Harrison Reynolds had been instrumental in creating investment opportunities specifically designed to target Michael's clients. Sophisticated financial products with hidden vulnerabilities that would have generated substantial commissions while eventually collapsing, leaving investors with significant losses. If the wedding had proceeded as planned, your son would likely have directed his clients toward these investments based on his father-in-law's recommendations, Detective Knowles explained during our meeting at the police station. The potential damage extends far beyond his personal finances. They were positioning him to unwittingly participate in defrauding his clients as well. This revelation hit Michael with visible physical impact, his professional identity and ethical standards having remained points of pride even as he processed other aspects of Vanessa's deception. The possibility that his hard-earned client relationships might have been weaponized against the very people who trusted him created a new dimension of horror in his understanding of what had nearly occurred. "They would have destroyed everything," he said quietly as we left the police station, his expression haunted. "Not just my savings, but my professional reputation, my client's security, every aspect of the life I've built." I nodded, understanding that this additional layer of intended harm required its own processing beyond the personal betrayal he had already been addressing. Throughout his childhood, Michael had demonstrated strong ethical foundations, returning extra change when cashiers made errors, refusing to participate in classroom cheating even when it was widespread, choosing honesty even when it carried personal costs. "The important thing is that it didn't happen," I reminded him gently. "Your clients are protected, your professional integrity remains intact, and you've helped expose operations that might have harmed many others." This perspective seemed to provide some comfort, shifting focus from what might have happened toward what had actually been prevented through the interrupted wedding. As we walked back to our temporary apartment, Michael's posture gradually relaxed, his thoughts apparently moving from shock toward integration of this new information. "Dad used to talk about fortunate disasters," he recalled as we waited at a crosswalk. "Events that seem catastrophic when they occur but ultimately prevent much worse outcomes that would have followed from the original path." The reference brought an immediate memory of Charles using exactly that phrase after Michael had broken his arm during high school soccer tryouts, an injury that prevented him from joining the team but created time for him to join the investment club that ultimately shaped his career direction. He believed that disruptions sometimes reset our trajectory in necessary ways, even when they're painful. I agreed. appreciating how Michael was beginning to frame his experience within broader perspective, rather than viewing it solely as personal. Catastrophe. By the time we reached the apartment, Michael seemed to have processed this latest revelation sufficiently to return to practical considerations about next steps. As we sorted through the final documentation needed for the ongoing legal proceedings, he made a decision that suggested healing had begun despite the continuing complications. "I'm going back to work next week," he announced, organizing papers into their respective folders. Not full client meetings yet, but beginning to reconnect with the office and professional responsibilities. I need to reclaim that part of my identity separate from everything that happened. The decision reflected resilience I had observed in Michael since childhood, his ability to compartmentalize effectively and continue functioning in areas unaffected by whatever challenge he was facing. As a boy, he had maintained excellent academic performance even during socially difficult periods, seeming to draw strength from the domains where his competence remained intact. That sounds like a healthy step, I agreed, recognizing that returning to professional responsibilities would provide both structure and purpose during his ongoing personal recovery. Just be prepared for well-meaning questions from colleagues who knew about the wedding. He nodded, having clearly considered this aspect. The firm has been surprisingly supportive. They're concerned about potential reputational damage from association with the Reynolds family, of course, but also genuinely concerned about my well-being. The managing partner called personally to offer resources and flexibility. This institutional support represented another foundation that remained intact despite Vanessa's systematic efforts to isolate Michael from potential support systems. Throughout his career, he had built professional relationships based on competence and integrity, connections that now offered stability during a period when his personal life remained in turmoil. As evening approached on what had been a particularly demanding day of legal meetings and documentation, Michael suggested we take a break from cooking and visit a small neighborhood restaurant we had discovered during our first week in Cambridge. The casual Italian place had become something of a refuge during difficult days, its unpretentious atmosphere and comfort food providing welcome contrast to the complex issues we were navigating. Over pasta and house wine, our conversation gradually shifted from case details and financial concerns toward more reflective territory, the kind of philosophical discussion that had characterized family dinners throughout Michael's childhood, when Charles would pose thought-provoking questions that encouraged deeper consideration of values and principles. "I've been thinking about trust," Michael said, breaking a breadstick into small pieces rather than meeting my eyes directly. "About whether it's possible to rebuild capacity for it after something like this." The question reflected concerns I had anticipated would eventually emerge as the immediate crisis response phase transitioned toward longer-term recovery. Throughout his childhood, Michael had demonstrated remarkable resilience regarding practical setbacks, but more vulnerability around relational disappointments, taking betrayals of trust particularly hard, even when they involved relatively minor childhood friendships. "Trust isn't a single faculty that gets permanently damaged," I suggested, drawing on both personal experience and professional understanding of recovery from security breaches. "It's more like a skill set that can be refined through experience, becoming more discerning without being eliminated." Michael considered this perspective, his expression thoughtful. "Dad used to say something similar about locks, that their purpose wasn't to make entry impossible, but to require legitimate credentials." The reference to Charles's security philosophy created a moment of connection that transcended our current circumstances. My late husband had indeed viewed physical security systems as filters rather than absolute barriers, designed to evaluate credentials and permit appropriate access while deterring unauthorized entry. "That's an apt comparison," I agreed. "Healthy, trust operates like a sophisticated security system. It doesn't eliminate all risk of breach, but it requires appropriate verification before granting access to vulnerable areas." This framing seemed to resonate, allowing Michael to view his experience through a more constructive lens that acknowledged both the necessity of maintaining capacity for trust and the importance of implementing appropriate verification processes. The conversation continued along these lines throughout dinner, exploring how security principles might apply to emotional vulnerability without creating isolation or excessive barriers to connection. As we walked back to our apartment through the pleasant early summer evening, Michael's demeanor suggested that our discussion had provided useful perspective for conceptualizing his path forward. The philosophical framework offered language and concepts for approaching recovery that aligned with his analytical thought processes while acknowledging the emotional dimensions of his experience. "I've made a decision about Philadelphia," he said, as we reached the building entrance. "I'm going to accept the transfer offer, not immediately, but with a start date in September. That gives me time to properly transition my Boston clients and find suitable housing without making decisions under duress." The thoughtful timeline reflected the balanced approach Charles and I had always tried to model. Neither impulsive reaction nor excessive delay, but measured consideration followed by deliberate action. Though I was personally pleased by his decision to return to Philadelphia, I was more encouraged by the process through which he had reached it, suggesting recovery of decision-making confidence that Vanessa's influence had temporarily undermined. "That sounds like a well-considered plan," I responded, careful to support his reasoning process rather than simply celebrating the outcome. "The transition period will give you space to ensure you're moving toward positive opportunities rather than just away from difficult associations." As we entered the apartment that had become our temporary headquarters for addressing the aftermath of near disaster, I found myself reflecting on how crisis often creates unexpected opportunities for recovery of connections that distance and time have weakened. The collaboration necessitated by practical concerns had created space for rebuilding relationship foundations that would likely endure well beyond the immediate circumstances that brought us together. 3 months after the wedding that wasn't, I returned to my Philadelphia home while Michael remained in Boston to finalize his professional transition. Our 6 weeks together in the Cambridge apartment had established new patterns of connection that continued despite the geographic separation. Regular video calls that extended beyond practical updates to include meaningful conversation, shared articles that sparked discussion, and a mutual openness that had been missing from our relationship for many years. As I settled back into my familiar routines, weekly chess games with Ramon at the senior center, occasional lock repair projects in my home workshop, tending the garden Charles and I had planted together, I found myself reflecting on how crisis often creates clarifying perspective that remains valuable long after the immediate emergency has passed. My comfortable colonial house felt different after the extended absence, not just in the physical sense of returning to a space that had sat empty, but in my emotional relationship with the home that had witnessed so much of my life's journey. The knowledge that someone had violated this space, that Vanessa had walked these halls, examined my possessions, and stolen family treasures, initially created a sense of unease that required conscious effort to overcome. Ramon had helped me install an updated security system upon my return, complete with cameras and motion sensors that would have seemed excessive before the Reynolds family's intrusion into our lives. As he programmed the final settings, he offered perspective that reflected his decades in law enforcement. "Security isn't about eliminating vulnerability," he observed, echoing principles I had applied throughout my locksmith career. "It's about creating appropriate boundaries that allow you to remain open where it matters while protecting what's valuable." This balanced approach to security, creating necessary safeguards without surrendering to fear or isolation, had guided my professional recommendations to clients throughout my career. Now I found myself applying these same principles to my personal recovery from having my home and family targeted by sophisticated predators. The police had recovered most of the stolen items, including Charles's pocket watch and my mother's sapphire ring. These treasured possessions now rested in a new safe with biometric access, installed in a different location than the one Vanessa had breached. The physical security upgrades provided practical protection, but the emotional security of reclaiming. My space required different measures: having friends visit for dinner, creating new memories in rooms that had been examined by unwelcome eyes, and refusing to allow violation to diminish my connection to the home Charles and I had shared. 6 weeks after my return to Philadelphia, as autumn began painting the neighborhood, trees in brilliant oranges and reds, Michael arrived for his first house hunting trip. His transfer to the Philadelphia office had been approved with a start date in early October, giving him approximately 1 month to find suitable housing and complete his relocation. As we toured condominiums and apartments in various neighborhoods, I observed subtle but significant changes in his approach to decision-making: more deliberate evaluation of practical considerations, less emphasis on status markers, and greater attention to community features that might facilitate genuine connection. These shifts suggested he was indeed rebuilding based on authentic values rather than reactive patterns or external expectations. "I'm leaning toward this Fairmount place," he said after our third day of viewings, spreading property information sheets across my kitchen table. "It's smaller than my Boston condo and further from downtown, but I like the neighborhood feel and being near the park. The financial district location looks better on paper, but it reminds me too much of what I'm trying to leave behind, the Thoughtful evaluation reflected integration of recent experiences into a more balanced perspective on what constituted genuine quality of life. Throughout his 20s and 30s, Michael had increasingly prioritized professional status markers: prestigious addresses, luxury amenities, visible success signals, over the community connections, and everyday pleasures that Charles and I had emphasized throughout his childhood. "Fairmount has character," I agreed, recognizing the neighborhood's blend of historic charm and contemporary convenience. "And it's just 15 minutes from here by car, which would make family dinners more convenient." The casual reference to regular family gatherings, something that had occurred only sporadically during his Boston years, brought a thoughtful expression to Michael's face. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Regular dinners, not just holiday visits. I've missed more than I realized." The acknowledgement created space for conversation about expectations and hopes for this new chapter of our relationship, how we might maintain the connection we had rebuilt during crisis while respecting the appropriate boundaries of our adult relationship. Throughout Michael's childhood, Charles and I had emphasized that healthy family bonds required both reliable connection and respect for individual autonomy, a balance that sometimes proved challenging to maintain across life transitions. "Want the convenience of being closer without creating expectations of constant interaction," Michael explained as we discussed the potential parameters of our relationship with him living nearby. "I need to build an independent life here while still having family connection as a foundation." The clarity of his articulation suggested therapeutic support, something he had reluctantly agreed to try during our time in Cambridge and apparently continued after my return to Philadelphia. This willingness to seek professional guidance represented significant growth from his previous resistance to anything that might be perceived as acknowledging vulnerability or need for assistance. "That sounds like a healthy approach," I agreed, appreciating his effort to establish clear communication about expectations. Regular connection without obligation or enmeshment. Perhaps a standing dinner invitation for Sundays, with both of us understanding that occasional conflicts will arise and don't represent rejection. This explicit discussion of relationship boundaries and expectations marked a new maturity in our mother-son dynamic, moving beyond the implicit assumptions that had sometimes created tension during his adult years toward more intentional cultivation of mutually satisfying connection. The process reminded me of conversations Charles and I had periodically throughout our marriage, when changing circumstances or emerging needs required conscious recalibration of our relationship patterns. The week of house hunting culminated in Michael making an offer on the Fairmount condominium, a two-bedroom unit in a converted historic building with character details that reflected appreciation for craftsmanship rather than merely luxury finishes. The property was within his financial means without requiring aggressive stretching, reflecting more balanced priorities than the status-driven housing choices he had made in Boston under Vanessa's influence. After submitting the offer through his real estate agent, Michael suggested we celebrate with dinner at a restaurant Charles had particularly enjoyed, an Italian place near Rittenhouse Square, where our family had marked special occasions throughout Michael's childhood and adolescence. The choice of venue created natural opportunity for reminiscence that bridged past connections with present rebuilding. "Dad would have approved of the Fairmount place," Michael observed as we settled at a corner table that afforded both privacy and a view of the restaurant's convivial atmosphere. He always said housing should reflect priorities beyond investment potential. The reference to Charles's wisdom, a frequent theme in our conversations since the wedding day disaster, suggested ongoing integration of family values that had temporarily been overshadowed by external influences during Michael's relationship with Vanessa. Throughout his formative years, Charles had emphasized that major purchases should align with core values, rather than merely maximizing financial return or projecting desired image. He believed in homes rather than houses, I agreed. Memories of house hunting with Charles in the early years of our marriage surfacing with unexpected clarity. He turned down properties with better appreciation potential because they didn't feel like places where everyday life would flourish. As our conversation continued through appetizers and main courses, Michael shared more details about his therapeutic journey over recent months, how processing the betrayal had led to deeper examination of patterns in his adult relationships and career choices that had gradually disconnected him from values he had once held central. "I realize now that I've been using professional achievement as a proxy for whole life success," he explained, the insight reflecting significant self-examination. Measurable outcomes were safer than the vulnerability of genuine connection, so I invested almost exclusively in the domain where I felt most competent. This recognition of how he had narrowed his life focus to avoid emotional risk demonstrated remarkable self-awareness that extended beyond merely processing Vanessa's manipulation. Throughout adolescence, Michael had shown similar tendencies toward over-investing in areas of natural strength while avoiding domains that required greater vulnerability or risked potential failure, a pattern Charles and I had tried to address through encouraging balanced development across academic, social, and personal dimensions. "Your father worried about that tendency," I acknowledged, choosing honesty over comfort in response to Michael's openness. He recognized it because he had similar inclinations early in his own life, achieving professional success while keeping emotional engagement somewhat compartmentalized. Michael nodded, unsurprised by this perspective on his father's concerns. "My therapist suggested that might be why Vanessa's approach was so effective. She targeted precisely the domain where I felt most confident, using apparent shared values. Around professional achievement to bypass normal caution I might have exercised in purely personal relationships." The insight demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how vulnerability to exploitation often connects to specific aspects of personal history and identity, rather than representing global naivety. Throughout his career as a financial analyst, Michael had demonstrated remarkable discernment regarding investment opportunities and business propositions, his critical assessment skills functioning effectively in professional contexts while remaining underdeveloped in personal relationship evaluation. As dinner concluded and we walked through Rittenhouse Square in the pleasant autumn evening, our conversation shifted toward the future. Michael's upcoming transition to the Philadelphia office, potential holiday plans now that we would be living nearby, and how we might both honor Charles's memory through maintaining traditions he had valued while creating new patterns appropriate to our current life stage. The balanced attention to both continuity and adaptation reflected healthy navigation of loss and transition, acknowledging the enduring significance of Charles's influence in our lives while recognizing that meaningful living required ongoing evolution rather than merely preserving past patterns. This perspective had guided my own journey through widowhood, allowing me to honor Charles's memory while still developing new connections and activities that provided current purpose and satisfaction. 2 weeks later, Michael's offer on the Fairmount condominium was accepted, establishing concrete timeline for his relocation to Philadelphia. The property required minor renovations before move-in, creating natural opportunity for collaboration that built upon the partnership we had established during the Cambridge period, while addressing practical needs rather than crisis response. "I'd like your input on the security setup," Michael said during a video call where he shared the inspection report and preliminary renovation plans. Not just standard locks, but integrated systems that provide meaningful protection without creating fortress mentality. The request acknowledged both my professional expertise and our shared experience with security breach, recognizing the need for appropriate safeguards while avoiding excessive reaction that might diminish quality of life through constant hypervigilance. Throughout my locksmith career, I had emphasized that effective security enhanced rather than constrained daily living, providing peace of mind that allowed greater freedom rather than creating barriers that limited engagement with community. "I'll help you design something balanced," I promised, appreciating his effort to address security concerns without surrendering to fear-based isolation that would ultimately serve the Reynolds family's purposes by diminishing his capacity for appropriate trust and connection. Protection where it matters without creating unnecessary barriers. As October approached and Michael's relocation date drew nearer, legal proceedings against the Reynolds family continued advancing through the judicial system. Harrison and Judith had accepted plea agreements that included substantial prison sentences and financial restitution in exchange for cooperation with authorities investigating other potential victims. Vanessa, however, had rejected all plea offers, apparently calculating that her direct involvement would be more difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Detective Knowles kept us informed of significant developments, including the discovery of at least 3 previous victims with remarkably similar experiences, successful professionals who had been systematically defrauded through romantic relationships with Vanessa under various aliases. This pattern confirmation provided cold validation of our narrow escape while raising difficult questions about whether earlier intervention might have been possible had these previous cases been more effectively connected. The system fragmentation is the biggest challenge in these cases, Detective Knowles explained during a conference call with both Michael and me as trial preparations proceeded. Different jurisdictions, various aliases, separate financial institutions. The patterns only become obvious when someone compiles all the data points, which rarely happens until multiple victims have already been affected. This systemic vulnerability paralleled issues I had observed throughout my security career, how protection failures often occurred not through individual component weaknesses, but rather through insufficient coordination across supposedly connected systems. The most sophisticated locks offered little protection when installed indoors with inadequate frames, just as financial security measures proved insufficient when social engineering provided access to supposedly protected information. Michael's response to these updates reflected his ongoing healing and perspective development, acknowledging the disturbing reality of deliberate predation while focusing attention on preventive education rather than merely retribution or self-recrimination. He had begun compiling his experience and insights into written form, initially as therapeutic processing, but gradually evolving toward potential public education about sophisticated financial exploitation targeting professionals. If sharing my experience helps even one person recognize warning signs earlier, some meaning emerges from what otherwise feels senseless, he explained when sharing early drafts of this project. Not just regarding romantic relationships, but any situation where emotional manipulation facilitates financial exploitation. This transformation of personal trauma into potential benefit for others demonstrated resilience that transcended mere recovery, finding purpose in painful experience, that might otherwise remain merely damaging. Throughout Michael's childhood, Charles had emphasized that difficult experiences could provide wisdom unavailable through more comfortable paths, though he had always been careful to distinguish this perspective from simplistic, everything happens, for a reason, platitudes that diminished genuine suffering. As moving day approached in early October, practical logistics demanded increased attention. Coordinating renovation completion, arranging furniture delivery, transferring utilities, and establishing necessary services for Michael's new home. These mundane tasks provided grounding counterbalance to the continuing emotional processing of recent events, creating tangible progress markers that reinforced forward movement despite ongoing legal complications. The day before Michael's official relocation, Detective Knowles called with unexpected news that would significantly reshape the legal aftermath of our experience. "Vanessa has accepted a plea agreement," she informed us, her tone suggesting complex implications beyond simple case resolution. 15 years with possibility of parole after 10, full financial restitution, and detailed cooperation regarding their operational methods. The sudden reversal of Vanessa's previous rejection of all plea offers sparked immediate questions about motivation and timing. Throughout the investigation, she had maintained confident resistance that suggested belief in her ability to avoid conviction through legal maneuvering and charm that had proven effective in previous situations. "What changed?" Michael asked, the speakerphone capturing both his voice and mine as we sat at my kitchen table reviewing final moving arrangements. "Another victim came forward with substantially more documentation than previous cases," Detective Knowles explained. "A wealth management executive in Chicago who became suspicious before marriage, but after significant financial access had been established. He documented everything meticulously once he recognized the pattern, recorded conversations, preserved communications, tracked account access. The evidence destroyed any reasonable chance of acquittal. This development, another potential victim, whose awareness had developed just in time to prevent complete exploitation, provided certain validation of our experience while raising complicated emotions about interconnected vulnerability and protection across apparently separate lives. The Chicago executive's methodical documentation had ultimately protected not only himself, but also those who might have become future targets, had the Reynolds family operation continued. Would Michael's testimony still be required? I asked, aware that court appearances represented significant emotional challenge that might impact his professional transition and ongoing recovery. No, that's part of the agreement. Full written statements, but no court appearance necessary from any victims, Detective Knowles confirmed. The prosecution has sufficient evidence without requiring testimony that might be re-traumatizing. They'll contact you about the restitution process once sentencing is finalized. After concluding the call, Michael and I sat in thoughtful silence, processing the implications of this unexpected resolution. The plea agreement represented practical conclusion to legal proceedings that might otherwise have extended for years, providing closure that allowed focus on rebuilding rather than remaining entangled in protracted court processes. I feel strangely disconnected from it, Michael acknowledged after several minutes of reflection, like it happened to someone else, or in a previous life. The legal consequences seem almost irrelevant to my actual recovery process. This perspective reflected significant healing, the ability to recognize that while accountability mattered, from justice perspective, his personal recovery depended more on rebuilt internal resources and authentic connections than external punishment of those who had caused harm. Throughout his childhood, Charles and I had emphasized that healing from injury required appropriate care of wounded areas rather than merely addressing what had caused the damage. Justice and healing operate on different timelines, I observed, sharing wisdom gained through both professional experience with security breaches and personal navigation of life's inevitable disappointments. They're connected but distinct processes with separate requirements. Michael nodded, understanding evident in his expression. The legal system handles justice while we handle healing. Parallel processes with occasional intersections but different, fundamental purposes. This balanced perspective demonstrated integration of difficult experience into coherent understanding that would support continued recovery without requiring perfect resolution of all associated emotions. Throughout life's challenges, Charles had modeled this capacity for moving forward without demanding complete emotional closure that rarely occurs in complex human experiences. The following day, official moving day, dawned with perfect autumn, weather that supported the transition's logistical requirements while providing symbolic fresh start appropriate to the occasion. Friends from Michael's college years arrived to help with unpacking and furniture arrangement, their presence representing continuing connections that had survived, despite Vanessa's systematic efforts to isolate him from independent relationships. That might have identified her manipulation earlier. As we worked together arranging Michael's new home, the conversation flowed naturally between practical considerations and deeper reflections on recent experiences. These friends, David the psychologist and Thomas who taught engineering at Drexel, had known Michael since before professional success became his primary identity marker, providing connections to aspects of himself that had been temporarily overshadowed during the Boston years. Remember sophomore year when you refused to participate in that investment competition because you discovered they were using manipulated historical data? Thomas asked as they assembled a bookshelf in the living room. You sacrificed potential. Recognition because the underlying structure violated your ethical standards, even though no one else seemed bothered by it. The anecdote, which I hadn't previously heard, highlighted character consistency that transcended Michael's temporary vulnerability to Vanessa's manipulation. Throughout his development, he had demonstrated strong ethical foundations and commitment to integrity, qualities that remained intact despite recent exploitation of specific vulnerabilities connected to his desire for partnership and professional validation. By late afternoon, the essential unpacking had been completed. Furniture, arranged in functional if not yet fully settled positions, and kitchen basics established for immediate living requirements. Michael's friends departed with plans for dinner the following weekend, leaving us to complete final organizational details before I would return to my own home for the evening. As we stood in the kitchen organizing cabinet contents, Michael paused, with a coffee mug in hand, one from his childhood that had somehow survived multiple moves and life transitions. The faded NASA logo reflected his early fascination with space exploration that had eventually evolved toward different professional directions, while maintaining the underlying appreciation for systems and order that characterized his approach to both finance and personal organization. I've been thinking about what prevented complete disaster, he said, carefully placing the mug on an upper shelf. Not just your discovery of Vanessa's plans, but what enabled you to recognize what everyone else missed. The question reflected ongoing processing of experience beyond merely understanding what had happened toward extracting meaningful insight that might inform future discernment. Throughout his childhood, Michael had demonstrated this capacity for meta-analysis, examining not just events themselves, but the patterns and principles that explained their development and might predict similar situations. I was outside the influence bubble, I suggested after considering various factors that had facilitated my recognition of warning signals. I saw Vanessa only periodically rather than through daily incremental boundary adjustments, and I wasn't emotionally or professionally invested in believing her presentation. Michael nodded, accepting this analysis while seeming to search for additional dimensions that might provide more comprehensive understanding. But plenty of people saw us occasionally without recognizing anything concerning. There was something specific about your perspective that allowed you to see what others missed. His persistence reminded me of similar conversations throughout his childhood and adolescence, when simple explanations rarely satisfied his need for deeper understanding of causal mechanisms and systemic patterns. This characteristic, sometimes challenging when he applied it to household rules or parental decisions, had served him well academically and professionally by driving thorough analysis rather than accepting surface explanations. I've spent my entire career studying security breaches, I acknowledged after further reflection, recognizing when access patterns don't align with appropriate authorization, identifying when apparent authentication conceals unauthorized entry. The principles apply across mechanical, digital, and human systems. This connection between my professional expertise and personal discernment appeared to resonate with Michael's analytical framework, providing conceptual understanding that extended beyond our specific experience toward broader principles regarding vulnerability assessment and protection. Throughout his childhood, he had absorbed security consciousness through countless conversations about lock mechanisms, access protocols, and systematic thinking about protection priorities. "You taught me similar principles," he observed, continuing, "cabinet organization while maintaining our conversation. I apply them religiously to financial systems and investment verification, but somehow compartmentalize them away from personal relationship evaluation." The insight demonstrated sophisticated self-awareness regarding how compartmentalization had created specific vulnerability, maintaining rigorous verification protocols in professional domains while suspending similar discernment in personal relationships where emotional needs might override security consciousness. This pattern recognition suggested development of integrated perspective that would support more balanced discernment across life domains moving forward. As evening approached and unpacking reached natural pausing point, we ordered delivery from a nearby restaurant rather than attempting cooking in the still settling kitchen. Sitting at Michael's newly assembled dining table with containers of Thai food between us, the conversation shifted toward future-oriented considerations rather than continued processing of recent events, a healthy balance between acknowledging significant experience while preventing it from dominating ongoing life development. "I'm thinking about expanding my volunteer activities beyond financial literacy," Michael shared between bites of pad thai. "Maybe something combining security education with elder protection, given what we've experienced. There's significant need for preventive education rather than just intervention after exploitation occurs." This direction reflected integration of personal experience into meaningful action that addressed broader social needs, transforming individual difficulty into community benefit through applying insights toward preventive education. Throughout his childhood, Charles had emphasized this approach to hardship, encouraging Michael to identify how personal challenges might generate wisdom that could benefit others facing similar situations. "Prevention through education aligns perfectly with your analytical strengths and communication skills," I encouraged, recognizing how this direction would leverage his professional expertise while expanding beyond purely financial focus that had previously dominated his identity. The most effective security combines technical protection with human awareness. Our conversation continued exploring potential avenues for this expanded focus. Possible organizations already addressing elder financial exploitation, educational approaches that effectively balanced awareness with appropriate trust maintenance, and how Michael's personal experience might provide credibility while requiring careful boundaries around disclosure details. The forward-looking discussion represented healthy integration of difficult experience into meaningful purpose, rather than allowing it to remain merely damaging chapter requiring containment. As I prepared to leave Michael in his new home for the first night, standing in the entryway with my purse and light jacket, an unexpected wave of emotion surfaced, not the anxiety or concern that might have accompanied separation during crisis period, but rather profound gratitude for the renewed connection that difficult circumstances had ultimately facilitated. "I never imagined when I climbed out that bathroom window that we'd end up here," I acknowledged, gesturing toward the pleasant space that represented not just physical relocation, but significant life recalibration. "Something meaningful emerging from what could have been complete disaster." Michael nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "Mom, when you showed up at the police station that day, even before I fully understood what was happening, some part of me felt relieved, like finally someone was seeing clearly when everything had been gradually distorted around me. The acknowledgement created space for expressing appreciation that transcended the emergency response that had initially reconnected us. Throughout Michael's adulthood, our relationship had maintained polite distance that preserved independence, while limiting genuine vulnerability or interdependence that might have supported earlier recognition of concerning patterns in his relationship with Vanessa. "I'm grateful for how you responded," he continued, emotion evident in his voice. "Not just alerting authorities, but how you helped afterward. Practical without being controlling, supportive without judgment, present without smothering. It was exactly what I needed but wouldn't have known to ask for." The specific appreciation for balanced support reflected Michael's growing awareness of healthy dependency that neither compromised appropriate adult autonomy nor demanded complete self-sufficiency during legitimate vulnerability. Throughout his childhood, Charles and I had attempted to model this balance, providing necessary structure and guidance while encouraging increasing independence appropriate to developmental capacity. "That's what family means," I responded simply, echoing words I had offered on the wedding day that now carried expanded meaning through subsequent experience. Not just biological connection, but chosen presence during both celebration and difficulty. As I drove home that evening through familiar Philadelphia neighborhoods now connected by Michael's renewed presence nearby, I reflected on how crisis often reveals essential truths about relationships that might remain obscured during more comfortable periods. The wedding day disaster had initiated painful but ultimately constructive recalibration of our mother-son relationship, creating space for authentic connection that balanced appropriate independence with meaningful interdependence. 6 months. After Michael's return to Philadelphia, as spring brought renewed life to gardens and parks throughout the city, Detective Knowles called with final update regarding the Reynolds family case. Sentencing had been completed, restitution orders established, and legal proceedings essentially concluded apart from potential parole hearings years in the future that would require notification, but not participation from identified victims. The formal victim impact statements have been processed and included in permanent records, she explained during a conference call with both Michael and me. The case database has been cross-referenced with similar fraud patterns nationally to help identify potential connections that might otherwise remain isolated incidents. Your experience has already helped prevent at least 2 additional potential victimizations through pattern recognition. This confirmation that our difficult experience had contributed to protecting others provided meaningful purpose beyond personal recovery, transforming private pain into public benefit through systematic knowledge sharing that might prevent similar exploitation. Throughout his career as security consultant, Charles had emphasized that effective protection required both individual vigilance and collective information sharing that allowed pattern recognition across apparently isolated incidents. Following this final official update, Michael and I continued our Sunday dinner tradition that had been established upon his return to Philadelphia, alternating between my home, his condominium, and occasional restaurants that held significance from various periods of family history. These regular gatherings provided reliable connection without excessive entanglement, the balanced relationship we had thoughtfully constructed following crisis-driven reconnection. During one such dinner at my home in late spring, as we enjoyed coffee and dessert on the back patio Charles had designed during his retirement years, Michael shared perspective that reflected significant integration of recent experiences into coherent understanding, supporting continued growth rather than merely damage containment. "I've been thinking about Dad's favorite saying about fortunate disasters," he began, watching a hummingbird visit the feeder hanging from nearby maple tree. The wedding day catastrophe was genuinely terrible, humiliating, financially damaging, professionally complicated, but it ultimately prevented much worse outcomes and created opportunity for important recalibration across multiple life dimensions. The balanced assessment acknowledged both genuine difficulty and meaningful growth that had emerged through navigation of challenging circumstances, perspective that reflected emotional maturity rather than simplistic positive reframing that would diminish authentic suffering involved. Throughout his childhood, Charles had modeled this nuanced approach to life's inevitable challenges. Acknowledging genuine pain while identifying potential growth without suggesting difficulty was necessary for development or minimizing real suffering experienced. The cost was significant, I agreed, honoring the genuine losses Michael had experienced through Vanessa's betrayal. But the alternative trajectory would have been devastating in ways that might have remained invisible until damage was irreparable. Our conversation continued exploring this balanced perspective, acknowledging both painful reality of exploitation and meaningful recovery that had ultimately strengthened rather than diminished capacity for appropriate trust and authentic connection. The wedding day disaster had indeed revealed uncomfortable truths about vulnerability and manipulation, but also demonstrated resilience and support systems that remained accessible despite temporary isolation. As evening deepened around us, fireflies, beginning to emerge in the garden Charles had planned with specific plants to attract them during summer months, Michael raised his coffee cup in simple gesture that required no elaborate explanation between us. "To bathroom locks that can be escaped," he said with smile that acknowledged both the drama and the deliverance of that pivotal day. I raised my own cup in response, completing the toast with parallel acknowledgement. "And to mothers who remember how to climb through windows." The moment captured a central truth that had emerged through our shared navigation of near disaster: that security ultimately depends not on preventing all potential breaches, but rather on maintaining capacity for recognition, response, and recovery when protection systems inevitably face sophisticated challenges. Throughout my locksmith career, I had emphasized this balanced understanding to clients seeking perfect protection that no mechanical or electronic system could genuinely provide. The wedding day disaster had indeed revealed uncomfortable vulnerabilities and sophisticated exploitation techniques, but it had also demonstrated resilience and connection that transcended temporary manipulation. Michael's relationship with Vanessa had nearly led to devastating personal and professional consequences, but timely intervention had prevented complete disaster while creating opportunity for meaningful recalibration across multiple life dimensions. We continued enjoying the peaceful evening in a garden designed by someone whose physical presence we had lost while maintaining connection to values he had embodied. I reflected on security principles that had guided both my professional work and personal navigation of life's challenges. The most effective protection combines appropriate boundaries with necessary openness, balancing vulnerability required for meaningful connection with discernment that identifies potential exploitation. Michael's journey through betrayal toward recovery had demonstrated both the necessity of maintaining capacity for trust and the importance of developing sophisticated verification processes that support rather than prevent genuine connection. The wedding day disaster had revealed both uncomfortable vulnerability and remarkable resilience, capacity for recognition, response, and recovery when protection systems faced sophisticated challenge. Looking at my son across the table, successful professional who had navigated personal betrayal without surrendering capacity for appropriate trust or authentic connection, I felt profound gratitude for both narrow escape from potential disaster and meaningful growth that difficult experience had ultimately facilitated. The mother who climbed through bathroom window and the son who recognized truth when finally presented had together navigated challenging passage toward more authentic relationship that balanced appropriate boundaries with genuine connection. The bathroom lock that failed to contain, and the police who responded to discovered evidence had together prevented wedding day disaster from becoming lifetime catastrophe, creating instead opportunity for recalibration and renewal that transformed potential tragedy into foundation for meaningful growth. Sometimes security breaches ultimately strengthen rather than diminish protection systems, revealing vulnerabilities that might otherwise remain unaddressed until damage becomes irreparable. As darkness settled around us, fireflies creating natural light display in garden Charles had designed specifically to attract them Michael and I continued quiet conversation that required no dramatic revelations or significant decisions, simply genuine connection between two people who had navigated difficult passage together and emerged with relationship strengthened rather than diminished by shared challenge. Security, I reflected as evening deepened around us, ultimately depends not on preventing all potential vulnerability, but rather on maintaining capacity for recognition, response, and recovery when protection systems inevitably face sophisticated challenges. Throughout 42 years as locksmith, I had emphasized this balanced understanding to clients seeking perfect protection that no mechanical or electronic system could genuinely provide. The most sophisticated lock mechanisms cannot prevent all potential breaches, but appropriate awareness and response protocols can minimize damage while preserving capacity for necessary openness that meaningful life requires. Michael's journey through betrayal toward recovery had demonstrated both the necessity of maintaining capacity for trust and the importance of developing sophisticated verification processes that support, rather than prevent, genuine connection. Perhaps that represents the most significant wisdom emerging from our shared experience, that security ultimately balances appropriate protection with necessary vulnerability, creating boundaries that filter rather than barriers that isolate. The mother who escaped bathroom imprisonment and the son who recognized truth when finally presented had together discovered that sometimes apparent disasters ultimately prevent much worse outcomes while creating opportunities for recalibration that might otherwise remain unavailable. As we finally moved inside when evening chill made continued patio sitting uncomfortable, I glanced back at garden Charles had designed. Living legacy that continued flourishing through ongoing care, rather than remaining static memorial to someone no longer physically present. Similarly, values he had embodied continued influencing our navigation of life's challenges through integration rather than mere remembrance, shaping responses to circumstances he could never have anticipated. That living legacy, values integrated, rather than merely remembered, had ultimately guided both my escape from locked bathroom and Michael's receptivity to difficult truth when presented with evidence of betrayal. Security consciousness balanced with capacity for authentic connection had together prevented wedding day disaster from becoming lifetime catastrophe, creating instead foundation for renewed relationship that honored both appropriate boundaries and genuine interdependence. Sometimes apparent disasters ultimately reveal essential truths that might otherwise remain obscured, creating opportunity for recalibration that prevents much worse outcomes while facilitating meaningful growth that transforms potential tragedy into foundation for renewed authenticity and connection. Security breaches, when appropriately addressed, can ultimately strengthen rather than diminish protection systems by revealing vulnerabilities before damage becomes irreparable. The locked bathroom that failed to contain, and the son who recognized truth when presented had together transformed wedding day disaster into fortunate recalibration that prevented much worse outcomes while creating opportunity for renewed connection based on authentic values rather than manipulation or obligation. Sometimes security depends less on preventing all potential breaches than on maintaining capacity for recognition, response, and recovery when protection systems inevitably face sophisticated challenges. As Michael and I continued comfortable conversation inside the home that had witnessed so much of our shared history, I felt profound gratitude for both narrow escape from potential disaster and meaningful growth that difficult experience had ultimately facilitated. The mother who remembered locksmith skills and the son who received difficult truth with remarkable resilience had together navigated challenging passage toward more authentic relationship that balanced appropriate boundaries with genuine connection, security, that protects what matters while permitting necessary vulnerability that meaningful life requires. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.